The November rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of the Oval Office as J. Edgar Hoover crossed the threshold, his face carved from granite, a leather briefcase chained to his wrist. The FBI director had requested this meeting with only 4 hours' notice, bypassing every protocol, every secretary, every buffer that normally stood between him and the president. Kennedy looked up from his desk, immediately recognizing the gravity etched into Hoover's expression, that particular shade of controlled panic the director reserved for genuine catastrophes. Outside, the Washington monuments disappeared into gray mist, as if the city itself were being slowly erased. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the weight of secrets about to shatter the fragile peace of an already dangerous world. Hoover placed the briefcase on the polished desk with deliberate slowness, the metallic click of the locks echoing like rifle shots in the hushed space. Inside lay photographs, surveillance transcripts, decoded messages, years of patient investigation compressed into damning evidence that would redefine everything Kennedy thought he knew about American security. The documents revealed a sprawling web of Soviet intelligence operatives embedded deep within the machinery of government, their roots spreading through agencies, laboratories, and classified facilities like poison through living tissue. Kennedy's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first surveillance photograph, showing a respected defense contractor passing documents to a man later identified as a KGB handler. The president's jaw tightened, his famous charisma draining away to reveal the raw fury beneath. Hoover's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Through silk, measured and cold, each word carefully weighted with decades of investigative experience. He spoke of dead drops in city parks, of microfilm hidden in hollowed coins, of American citizens who had traded their country's survival for Moscow's promises and Moscow's gold. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, a penetration so complete that Kennedy wondered aloud which of his own staff might be compromised. Which friendly face at state dinners might be reporting his words to Kremlin handlers. The Cambridge 5 scandal in Britain had shocked the Western world just months earlier, but this, Hoover explained grimly, suggested America's infiltration might be even deeper, even more damaging. Kennedy stood and walked to the rain-streaked window, his reflection ghostly against the storm, understanding that the enemy had not just reached the gates, but had been living in the rooms upstairs all along. The president turned back to Hoover, his voice steady despite the earthquake of implications, and asked the only question that mattered in that moment. How long had they been inside? How much had been stolen? And most critically, did Moscow know that Washington finally knew? The Cold War had just become infinitely colder, and Kennedy realized with crystalline clarity that every decision he made from this moment forward would be shadowed by invisible watchers, by compromised channels, by the possibility that his own house had become the enemy's most valuable listening post. Hoover closed the briefcase, the locks snapping shut with finality, and waited for the orders that would reshape American intelligence. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, washing over the Capitol like tears over a betrayed nation, while inside the Oval Office, 2 men began planning a silent war that the American people could never know was being fought in their name. Kennedy's hands slammed against the mahogany desk with such force that the photographs scattered like autumn leaves, his composure finally shattering under the weight of Hoover's revelations. The president's face flushed crimson as he absorbed the full scope of the betrayal, understanding that while he'd been navigating public crises and Cold War brinkmanship, the enemy had been reading his most sensitive communications, perhaps even predicting his moves before he made them. His voice, usually smooth and controlled, cracked with barely contained rage as he demanded names, locations, anything concrete he could grasp in this nightmare of shadows and deception. Hoover, unmoved by presidential fury, calmly retrieved a typed list from his briefcase, explaining that the compromised included mid-level bureaucrats with access to NATO planning documents, scientists, working on missile guidance systems, and analysts within the State Department who shaped American foreign policy. Kennedy felt the floor shift beneath him, realizing that every advantage he thought America possessed might have been an illusion, carefully maintained by Moscow to keep him confident while they dismantled national security from within. The president walked to his desk and poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands, the crystal tumbler chattering against the pitcher's rim like nervous teeth. He thought of Khrushchev's smug confidence during their Vienna summit earlier that year, the Soviet premier's knowing smile that had seemed almost mocking, and suddenly, Kennedy understood why the man had been so certain, so unshakable in his positions. The Bay of Pigs disaster still haunted his administration, a failure that had damaged his credibility both domestically and internationally. And now this, a security breach so profound it made that military debacle seem almost trivial by comparison. Kennedy's mind raced through the implications like a drowning man grasping for air, calculating how many operations had been compromised, how many agents abroad might have been exposed, how many American strategies had been telegraphed to Moscow before they were even fully formed. Hoover watched the president's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally a cold, calculating resolve that transformed his features into something harder, something forged by the recognition that gentlemanly politics had no place in this shadow war. Kennedy returned to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, watching anonymous figures hurry through the rain below, wondering how many were exactly what they seemed and how many served two masters. His breath fogged the bulletproof pane as he spoke almost to himself, questioning how previous administrations had allowed such rot to take root, how the very institutions designed to protect America had become corridors for its enemies. The weight of his office had never felt heavier than in this moment, understanding that he couldn't simply rage against the breach, but had to think strategically, had to turn this disaster into something resembling advantage or watch American power crumble under Soviet intelligence superiority. Hoover cleared his throat quietly, reminding Kennedy that decisions needed to be made, that every moment of indecision gave Moscow more time to extract secrets, to deepen their networks, to fortify positions that might take decades to root out. The president turned back to face his FBI director, his expression now carved from the same granite as Hoover's, youth and inexperience burned away by the fire of this revelation. Kennedy's voice, when he finally spoke again, carried the cold certainty of a man who had just crossed an invisible threshold, leaving behind whatever illusions of Cold War civility he might have harbored. He ordered Hoover to assemble a complete assessment within 48 hours, to identify every suspected operative, every compromised channel, every vulnerability that Moscow had exploited while American intelligence slept. The storm outside intensified, lightning briefly illuminating the Oval Office in stark white flashes, casting dramatic shadows across walls that had witnessed countless crises, but perhaps none quite so personal, quite so threatening to the very foundation of American sovereignty in this most dangerous era of human history. The classified cable from London had arrived just 3 weeks earlier, its contents so devastating that Kennedy had read it twice before believing the words were real, before accepting that Britain's most trusted intelligence officers had spent decades selling Western secrets to Moscow like merchants in a bazaar. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, names that had once represented the cream of British intelligence, now synonymous with betrayal so profound it had crippled Anglo-American trust and exposed countless operations across Europe. Kennedy had studied their photographs in the secure briefing room, trying to understand how men of such privilege and education could systematically destroy their own countries, could watch fellow agents die because of information they'd passed to Soviet handlers. The Cambridge 5 scandal had torn through the intelligence community like a plague, forcing agencies on both sides of the Atlantic to question everything they thought they knew about loyalty, ideology, and the true cost of the ideological war being waged in shadows. These weren't rough criminals or desperate refugees selling information for survival. They were sophisticated intellectuals who'd made calculated decisions to serve Moscow, to undermine democracy from positions of ultimate trust. Hoover had invoked the British disaster deliberately during their meeting, knowing it would strike Kennedy where he was most vulnerable, in that realm where personal trust intersected with national security and catastrophic consequences. The FBI director had laid out photographs of the Cambridge traitors alongside his own suspects, drawing uncomfortable parallels between London's failures and Washington's current vulnerabilities, suggesting that American exceptionalism offered no protection against determined infiltration. Kennedy had protested initially, arguing that British-class snobbery and their recruitment from elite universities created unique vulnerabilities that didn't exist in America's more democratic institutions. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. The Soviet intelligence services had proven themselves patient and sophisticated, capable of identifying ideological sympathizers decades before activating them, of exploiting every crack in Western security, regardless of national character or political system. Now, staring at Hoover's evidence spread across his desk, Kennedy couldn't escape the terrifying parallel, couldn't ignore that what had devastated British intelligence might already be replicated throughout American government. The Cambridge Five had operated for nearly 2 decades before exposure, feeding Moscow everything from atomic secrets to operational plans, their betrayal only discovered through defector testimony and painstaking counterintelligence work. How many years had Soviet agents been operating in Washington, Kennedy wondered. How many secrets had already crossed the Atlantic while America slept, confident in its security measures and institutional safeguards? The British example proved that confidence was not protection, that sophistication was not immunity, that even the most established intelligence services could harbor traitors in their innermost circles. The president's hands trembled slightly as he lifted one of Hoover's photographs, studying the face of an American suspect who looked disturbingly ordinary, who could have been any bureaucrat in any agency across the vast federal apparatus. If it happened to Britain, with all their legendary tradecraft and centuries of intelligence experience, Kennedy realized with cold certainty it had almost certainly already happened here, perhaps on an even larger scale. The Cambridge Five had been a warning that America had failed to heed, and now the bill for that complacency sat before him in manila folders marked with classifications so high that even most cabinet members would never see their contents. The cabinet room felt smaller than usual when Kennedy gathered his inner circle that grey November afternoon. The polished mahogany table, suddenly, transformed from a symbol of executive power into a battlefield planning table where America's survival hung in the balance. Robert Kennedy arrived first, his tie loosened and shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night spent reviewing preliminary intelligence files, followed by McGeorge Bundy carrying thick binders stamped with red diagonal warnings. Then CIA Director John McCone, whose expressionless face betrayed years of managing impossible secrets. Hoover entered last, deliberately positioning himself at the far end of the table where he could observe everyone's reactions, where his institutional authority over domestic intelligence could dominate the room's geography. Kennedy had ordered the Secret Service to clear the corridor outside, to ensure no stenographers or aides lingered within earshot, because what would be discussed in this room could never appear in any official record or presidential archive. The weight of absolute secrecy pressed down on them all like a physical force, making every breath feel measured and every word potentially consequential. Kennedy began without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a man forcing himself toward composure when every instinct demanded action. "Gentlemen, we're facing a counterintelligence crisis that makes our previous concerns look like children's games," he said, gesturing toward the folders Hoover had distributed around the table. The evidence suggests Soviet intelligence has achieved penetration of our government that rivals or exceeds what they accomplished in Britain. Robert Kennedy interrupted with characteristic directness, demanding to know how many individuals were under suspicion, which agencies had been compromised, whether anyone with direct access to the president himself appeared on Hoover's lists. The questions came rapid fire, reflecting not just brotherly concern, but prosecutorial instinct honed through years of investigating organized crime and corruption. McCone cleared his throat, preparing to present the CIA's assessment, while Bundy scribbled notes in his precise handwriting, already thinking 3 moves ahead about containment strategies and plausible deniability. The briefing that followed transformed theoretical Cold War threats into concrete nightmares, as Hoover methodically outlined networks of agents operating with sophisticated tradecraft learned from Moscow Center's most experienced handlers. Dead drops in public parks, where classified documents changed hands beneath the cover of ordinary activities, shortwave radio transmissions carrying coded messages from suburban homes to distant Soviet receivers, compromised cipher clerks providing encryption keys that rendered American diplomatic communications transparent to enemy analysis. Each revelation landed like a physical blow, forcing the assembled advisors to confront how thoroughly their assumptions about American security had been undermined by patient, professional espionage operations. Kennedy listened with growing fury, barely contained beneath his presidential demeanor, occasionally glancing at his brother, whose jaw tightened with each new detail, whose hands gripped the table edge until his knuckles whitened. When Hoover finished, silence filled the cabinet room like floodwater, drowning the usual confident banter of powerful men accustomed to solving problems through resources and determination. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. We turn this around, we make their infiltration our advantage, or we accept that we've already lost the Cold War without ever realizing the decisive battle happened in our own backyard. The words hung in the air, transforming despair into operational challenge, shifting the room's energy from shock toward calculated response. Robert Kennedy nodded slowly, understanding immediately what his brother proposed, recognizing the dangerous game of counterintelligence chess that would require patience, deception, and nerves stronger than any they'd yet demonstrated in this endless twilight struggle. Hoover spread the surveillance photographs across the polished table like a dealer, revealing a fatal hand, each grainy black and white image capturing Soviet operatives in moments they believed invisible to American eyes. The first photograph showed a middle-aged man in a gray overcoat bending to tie his shoelace beneath a park bench in Lafayette Square, his hand depositing a hollowed-out container into a carefully carved recess. In the wooden slat, the entire exchange lasting less than 3 seconds yet, captured perfectly by FBI cameras hidden in a nearby maintenance vehicle. Another image revealed a woman feeding pigeons near the Lincoln Memorial, her seemingly casual gesture scattering breadcrumbs that masked the retrieval of a chalk mark on a nearby lamppost. The signal indicating a dead drop was ready for collection. Kennedy studied each photograph with the intensity of a man searching for answers in shadows, his finger tracing the figures as though physical contact might reveal their secrets, might explain how his country had become a playground for enemy intelligence operations conducted with brazen confidence. The communications intercepts proved even more disturbing than the photographs, typewritten pages filled with decoded transmissions that read like inventories of American vulnerabilities systematically catalogued and reported to Moscow. One document detailed the movement schedules of nuclear materials between production facilities and military installations, information so sensitive that only a handful of officials should have possessed it, yet somehow transmitted via shortwave radio from a residential neighborhood in Arlington to a listening post operating thousands of miles away. Another intercept contained verbatim quotes from classified National Security Council meetings, complete with attribution to specific speakers, proving that Soviet intelligence had achieved penetration at the highest levels of American strategic planning. McCone pointed to a particularly damaging report describing advances in satellite reconnaissance technology, innovations that had cost billions in development funds and represented years of scientific breakthroughs, now compromised before deployment, could provide any operational advantage against Soviet military capabilities. Bundy's hands trembled slightly as he examined a list of suspected agents, names typed in capital letters beside their positions within government bureaucracy, each entry representing a potential cancer, metastasizing through the body of American security. Department of Defense analysts with access to contingency war plans, State Department officers handling diplomatic communications with NATO allies, even low-level clerks in the White House Communication Office who processed classified cables arriving from embassies worldwide. The scope suggested not opportunistic recruitment, but systematic targeting, patient cultivation of sources positioned to provide maximum intelligence value over extended periods. Robert Kennedy slammed his palm against the table, the sharp crack breaking the oppressive silence, his voice hoarse with barely controlled rage, demanding to know how long these operations had continued undetected, how many secrets had already crossed the Atlantic to enemy hands, whether anything remained secure in this compromised landscape. The final evidence proved most chilling in its ordinariness, everyday objects transformed into espionage tools through technical sophistication that seemed almost science fiction, yet existed in tangible form on the cabinet room table. A hollowed coin containing microfilms so small it required magnification to read, recovered from a dead drop in Rock Creek Park. A shortwave receiver disguised as a common household radio, its modified circuits capable of receiving encrypted transmissions on frequencies reserved for Soviet intelligence. Communications. Invisible ink formulations analyzed by FBI laboratories, their chemical compositions revealing Moscow's latest advances in covert communication methodology. Kennedy picked up the coin, turning it over in his fingers, feeling its weight and contemplating how something so ordinary could represent such extraordinary betrayal, how the currency of American commerce had been literally hollowed out to serve enemy purposes. Kennedy's decision emerged not from hesitation, but from calculated strategic thinking, honed through years of naval intelligence experience and political warfare, his mind recognizing that dramatic arrests would provide momentary satisfaction while sacrificing long-term advantage in the endless chess match against Moscow's intelligence apparatus. He stood from his chair and walked to the windows overlooking the rose garden, autumn sunlight filtering through glass as he spoke without turning, his voice carrying the weight of command tempered by careful deliberation about consequences that would ripple far beyond this room. The president understood that exposed spies could be replaced within months, their networks rebuilt with different faces and new cover identities, but monitored operatives represented living channels through which American counterintelligence could observe Soviet priorities, manipulate their information gathering, and ultimately transform enemy assets into unwitting tools serving American interests. Robert Kennedy protested immediately, his prosecutor's instinct demanding justice and punishment. Yet his brother raised one hand in a gesture requesting patience, requesting trust in a strategy that required playing a longer game than courtroom victories could provide. The counterintelligence potential fascinated Kennedy with possibilities that seemed drawn from spy novels, yet represented proven methodology in the shadow world where nations fought without acknowledging warfare existed. Hoover outlined how continued surveillance would reveal the complete architecture of Soviet networks, exposing not just the operatives already identified, but their handlers, communication methods, and ultimately the intelligence priorities directing their activities from Moscow Center headquarters thousands of miles away. McCone added that controlled feeding of disinformation through these channels could mislead Soviet military planning, convincing them that American defense capabilities existed in areas where none were deployed, or that vulnerabilities existed where American strength remained overwhelming. Kennedy absorbed these possibilities, like a student discovering new dimensions to problems previously considered from limited perspectives, his strategic imagination engaging with scenarios where apparent weakness became actual strength through the alchemy of deception. The president ordered a comprehensive monitoring program that would track every identified operative with resources previously reserved for the most sensitive national security operations. FBI surveillance teams would document every meeting, every dead drop, every communication, while remaining invisible to their targets, who must continue believing their operations remained undetected and successful. Technical experts would photograph documents before they reached Soviet hands, allowing analysts to understand exactly what information Moscow possessed and how they might interpret intelligence that could be subtly modified to support American strategic deception. Kennedy's voice carried absolute authority as he emphasized that no arrests would occur without his direct personal authorization, that this operation required discipline and patience that might take years to yield dividends. But those dividends could shift the balance in a Cold War where perception often mattered more than reality. The room fell silent as everyone present understood they were witnessing a presidential decision that prioritized long-term strategic advantage over immediate emotional satisfaction, choosing to live with known enemies operating within American institutions rather than eliminating them and returning to dangerous ignorance about Soviet intelligence capabilities. Kennedy turned from the window, his expression revealing neither doubt nor triumph, only the grim determination of a leader accepting burdens that came with power and responsibility in an era when one miscalculation could trigger nuclear annihilation. Kennedy retreated to the residential quarters that evening, loosening his tie as he sank into the leather chair where Lincoln once contemplated his own impossible choices, the weight of secrets pressing against his chest like physical objects demanding acknowledgement. The October twilight painted the walls in shades of amber and shadow, while he nursed a scotch that provided no comfort, only the bitter taste of isolation that accompanied knowledge too dangerous for public consumption. He understood that revelation of Soviet infiltration would ignite panic across America. Citizens questioning every neighbor and colleague, the paranoia of earlier Red Scares returning with justified foundation this time, tearing at the social fabric he'd sworn to protect. His thoughts drifted to the Bay of Pigs disaster still fresh in national memory, that catastrophic failure that had damaged his credibility with both allies and adversaries, making this new crisis feel like a second blow that could permanently cripple his presidency. The American people had elected him, promising vigorous leadership and confident strength against communist expansion. Yet here he sat concealing evidence that the enemy had penetrated the very institutions citizens trusted to protect them. Political opponents would weaponize this revelation mercilessly, suggesting his administration had lost control of national security, that the young president lacked the experience and judgment necessary for Cold War leadership. Jackie entered quietly, reading his mood without requiring explanation, sitting beside him in understanding silence that married couples develop when words become inadequate for expressing shared burdens. He confided his fears in whispered fragments, explaining how exposure of the infiltration network would force immediate arrests that eliminated his strategic advantage while simultaneously confirming Soviet success in penetrating American defenses. The public would demand accountability and punishment. Congressional investigations would consume his administration's energy and attention, diverting resources from civil rights legislation and economic programs that actually improved American lives. His voice carried frustration born from impossible choices between transparency and security, between democratic accountability and the pragmatic deceptions that intelligence warfare demanded from leaders navigating nuclear-age complexities. Robert had argued for limited disclosure, perhaps revealing minor arrests while concealing the operation's full scope, but Kennedy recognized that partial truth often proved more dangerous than complete silence or total honesty. His presidency hung suspended between the leader Americans believed they had elected and the ruthless strategist circumstances required him to become, each decision carving away pieces of idealism that had animated his campaign. Jackie's hand found his in the gathering darkness, offering comfort without solutions, understanding that some presidential burdens permitted no sharing beyond these private moments. Morning would bring another performance before cameras and crowds, projecting confidence while concealing doubts, smiling while carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour. Kennedy finished his scotch and set the glass aside, steeling himself for the long deception ahead, accepting that history might judge him harshly for choices made in shadows far from public witness. The residence fell, silent except for distant traffic sounds drifting through bulletproof windows, the president alone, with consequences that would ripple far beyond his understanding into futures he could only imagine. His reflection stared back from darkened glass, revealing a man aging faster than calendars measured, youth consumed by responsibilities that demanded everything, while promising nothing except more impossible decisions tomorrow. The morning light barely penetrated the Oval Office curtains when Kennedy assembled his intelligence chiefs, their faces carved from the same granite determination that marked men who understood warfare extended far beyond battlefields into shadows where truth became currency and deception transformed into patriotic duty. Hoover sat rigid with files stacked before him like ammunition, while McCone chain-smoked with the nervous energy of someone who had witnessed empires crumble through careless whispers, and Robert Kennedy paced near the windows, his prosecutorial instincts demanding action against enemies operating within American borders. The president's voice carried unusual steel as he authorized Operation Solo's expansion, approving surveillance protocols that would have horrified civil libertarians but seemed absolutely essential when Soviet intelligence officers walked freely through government corridors, stealing secrets that protected millions. His directive was precise and uncompromising: monitor every suspect, document every contact, but avoid premature arrests that would alert Moscow to American awareness while simultaneously losing the opportunity to feed carefully crafted disinformation back through compromised channels. The room hummed with tension as Kennedy explained his strategy of transforming defensive crisis into offensive advantage, using the enemy's confidence in their penetration against them by controlling what information flowed eastward across the Atlantic. McCone nodded slowly, recognizing the dangerous elegance of allowing known spies to continue operating under microscopic observation, turning them into unwitting conduits for falsified technical data and strategic deceptions that would mislead Soviet military planning. The authorization documents Kennedy signed that afternoon represented powers previous generations would have considered unthinkable in peacetime, yet the Cold War had rendered such distinctions meaningless when nuclear arsenals stood ready to incinerate civilization within 30 minutes of executive command. Telephone taps multiplied across Washington like electronic spiderwebs. FBI surveillance teams shadowed suspects through Georgetown restaurants and Alexandria safehouses, while CIA technicians developed sophisticated equipment for photographing. documents and recording conversations without leaving trace evidence of American counterintelligence awareness. Robert coordinated with Justice Department lawyers to establish legal frameworks that could withstand eventual scrutiny, though everyone understood these operations existed in ethical gray zones where constitutional protections collided with existential security requirements. The president insisted on personal briefings every 72 hours, demanding to know which suspects had contacted handlers, what information had been passed, and how successfully the disinformation campaign was proceeding without alerting Soviet intelligence to the compromised networks. Kennedy's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed surveillance photographs showing American citizens betraying their country for ideology or money. Each image a personal wound that deepened his resolve to win this invisible war, regardless of moral costs. The double agents became Kennedy's secret weapons, individuals turned through various combinations of patriotic appeal, financial incentive, or legal coercion, now feeding Moscow carefully calibrated lies wrapped in enough truth to maintain credibility with suspicious KGB controllers. These men and women lived precarious existences balanced between competing intelligence services, knowing that discovery meant death or imprisonment, depending on which side recognized their duplicity first, their courage sustained only by handlers who understood their psychological fragility and operational value. Kennedy met one such agent briefly in a secured facility, studying the hollow eyes of someone who had sacrificed normal life for secrets and deceptions, returning home each night to families who could never know the dangerous game played daily in their name. The encounter haunted him for weeks afterward, this tangible reminder that his strategic decisions transformed real people into expendable assets, their lives wagered against intelligence advantages measured in marginal percentages and temporary tactical gains. The president understood that history might celebrate his counterintelligence victories while forgetting the individuals consumed by machinery he had set in motion, their sacrifices buried in classified files that would remain sealed long after everyone involved had turned to dust. The machinery of surveillance and deception expanded throughout late 1961, becoming permanent infrastructure that would outlast Kennedy's presidency and define American intelligence operations for decades, creating precedents and capabilities that future administrations would inherit without fully understanding the moral compromises originally required to establish them. The conversation happened in the residential quarters where brothers could speak without the formality that governed official meetings, bourbon glasses catching amber light from table lamps, while Washington slept outside windows that framed a city concealing enemies neither man could easily identify among familiar faces. Robert had pressed for immediate action against the entire network, his prosecutors' instinct demanding arrests and public trials that would expose Soviet operations and punish betrayal with maximum visibility. But John shook his head with the weary patience of someone who had learned that visible victories often concealed strategic defeats. The president walked to the window overlooking the south lawn, where frost was beginning to silver the grass, his reflection ghostly against the darkness beyond, and spoke the words that would define his approach to this invisible war with brutal honesty. "They're in our house, Bobby, and we invited them to the damn party," Kennedy said quietly, the admission carrying layers of frustration with previous administrations whose security lapses had created vulnerabilities Soviet intelligence had exploited with methodical thoroughness. The phrase encapsulated everything wrong with American complacency during years when ideological conflicts seemed abstract rather than existential, when background checks were cursory and Cold War threats appeared distant rather than embedded within government institutions. Robert stopped pacing and stared at his brother, recognizing in those words both accusation and acceptance of inherited problems that required solutions more sophisticated than righteous anger could provide. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding that this infiltration represented systemic failure spanning multiple presidencies, intelligence agencies, and security protocols that had prioritized efficiency over vigilance until enemies walked freely through corridors of power. Kennedy's metaphor revealed his comprehensive grasp of how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated American institutions by exploiting the very openness that defined democratic society, turning constitutional protections and academic freedom into weapons against the nation that guaranteed those rights. The invitation he referenced was not literal, but historical. The accumulated carelessness of agencies that had allowed ideological sympathizers to embed themselves during Depression-era enthusiasm for communist alternatives, then failed to adequately purge those networks when wartime alliances gave way to Cold War antagonism. His frustration encompassed not just current threats, but decades of institutional blindness that had normalized the presence of individuals whose ultimate loyalty belonged to Moscow rather than Washington, making the current crisis simultaneously urgent and predictable. Robert understood immediately that his brother's strategy of observation, rather than immediate arrest, stemmed from recognizing they faced not merely individual spies, but comprehensive networks requiring systematic dismantling, rather than dramatic gestures that would scatter operatives beyond reach. The Bourbon conversation continued past midnight as brothers became strategists, mapping invisible battlefields where victories would never be publicly celebrated and defeats might only become apparent years after crucial information had flowed to Soviet analysts interpreting American intentions and capabilities. Kennedy's quote would be recorded in Robert's private journals and later appear in memoirs published after both brothers were gone, offering historians insight into presidential thinking during one of the Cold War's most dangerous infiltration crises. The phrase captured perfectly the paradox of democratic society defending itself against totalitarian infiltration without becoming totalitarian in the process, maintaining constitutional principles while acknowledging those same principles created vulnerabilities that authoritarian systems never faced. Their conversation eventually shifted to operational details and legal frameworks, but the central metaphor remained, defining how Kennedy understood both the problem's scope and the inadequacy of simple solutions when dealing with enemies who had spent decades learning American systems well enough to exploit them with devastating effectiveness. The residential quarters fell quiet near dawn as both men finally exhausted immediate topics, though neither truly rested afterward. Their minds continuing to work through scenarios where one miscalculation could expose operations or trigger diplomatic incidents that would escalate tensions already approaching nuclear thresholds. Kennedy carried that burden privately through subsequent months, maintaining public confidence while privately managing counterintelligence operations that grew increasingly complex as surveillance revealed connections extending further than initial assessments had suggested. The quote he had spoken to Robert became personal shorthand for acknowledging uncomfortable truths about American vulnerability, reminding himself that effective response required accepting responsibility for problems inherited rather than deflecting blame onto predecessors who could no longer defend their decisions. His words echoed through classified briefings and surveillance reports, a recurring theme that shaped how intelligence chiefs understood their mission was not merely catching spies, but fundamentally reforming security culture that had allowed infiltration to reach crisis levels requiring presidential intervention and permanent institutional transformation. Kennedy's response to the infiltration crisis established protocols that outlived both the president and the Soviet Union itself, transforming American counterintelligence from reactive investigation into proactive warfare that assumed penetration rather than hoping for security. The surveillance networks authorized during those tense months of 1961 became permanent infrastructure, Surveillance techniques refined through tracking Soviet operatives evolved into systems that monitored diplomatic communications, academic exchanges, and technological transfers. With institutional paranoia that accepted no relationship as innocent until proven otherwise. FBI counterintelligence divisions expanded geometrically, recruiting linguists and analysts who spent careers mapping invisible networks connecting diplomats to handlers, handlers to cutouts, cutouts to operatives whose American credentials concealed foreign loyalties that operated beneath ordinary professional identities. The sophistication Kennedy demanded became foundational doctrine. Training generations of intelligence officers who understood their mission involved not dramatic arrests, but patient observation, turning enemy operations into windows, revealing Soviet priorities while feeding carefully constructed disinformation that shaped Moscow's understanding of American capabilities and intentions through channels the Kremlin trusted precisely because they had established them. The permanent vigilance Kennedy instituted created institutional memory that survived presidential transitions and political shifts, embedding counterintelligence awareness throughout government agencies that had previously treated security as administrative burden rather than existential necessity. Universities received funding for security programs disguised as research initiatives. Defense contractors implemented compartmentalization protocols that prevented individual employees from accessing information beyond immediate requirements. Background investigations became exhaustive processes examining not just criminal records, but ideological affiliations, foreign contacts, and psychological vulnerabilities that Soviet recruiters had historically exploited with devastating success. The culture transformed slowly but comprehensively, replacing the naive openness Kennedy's metaphor had captured with calculated suspicion that questioned every unexplained contact, every unauthorized disclosure, every pattern suggesting information flowed through unofficial channels toward destinations that served interests fundamentally opposed to American survival. His legacy was not spectacular arrests that dominated headlines, but invisible architecture of protection that made subsequent infiltration exponentially more difficult, forcing Soviet intelligence to invest years developing single sources where previously they had operated networks with relative impunity. The Cold War's intelligence dimension became defined by this sustained counterintelligence pressure that Kennedy's crisis response had initiated, transforming U.S.-Soviet espionage into attritional warfare where both sides invested enormous resources protecting secrets while attempting penetration that grew increasingly sophisticated as defensive measures evolved. Double-agent operations Kennedy, authorized, became standard practice, creating labyrinths of deception where Moscow never knew with certainty whether sources were genuine or controlled channels feeding information designed to mislead, manipulate, and misdirect Soviet strategic planning during decades when nuclear miscalculation could trigger apocalypse. The paranoia this generated within Soviet intelligence ranks became its own weapon, prompting purges of genuine agents suspected of being American plants, fracturing trust between operatives and handlers whose communications were shadowed by possibility that everything they believed secure had been compromised by adversaries who had learned to think like Soviets, while protecting American secrets with newfound ruthlessness. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed 30 years after Kennedy confronted those classified documents, intelligence analysts recognized that sustained counterintelligence pressure had contributed to the empire's disintegration by forcing massive resource allocation toward espionage, operations that yielded diminishing returns against American defenses that grew exponentially more sophisticated. Kennedy's lasting contribution was not eliminating penetration, but establishing permanent defensive posture that made infiltration prohibitively expensive, while turning Soviet operations into counterintelligence opportunities that extracted strategic advantage from the very networks Moscow believed represented their greatest intelligence triumph on American soil during years when ideological conflict remained abstract to citizens who never knew how close enemies had actually come to their institutions of power. Did Kennedy's invisible war shape intelligence operations more than any public Cold War confrontation? Subscribe to explore the classified decisions that defined superpower conflict beyond what history books reveal.